When people talk about global power, most immediately think of aircraft carriers, fighter jets, and nuclear weapons. This is the kind of power the United States and its allies rely on. But over the past few decades, another superpower has emerged, China, and it plays by very different rules. For China, power is not about military parades or loud political statements. It is about debt leverage, legal agreements, and strategic alliances. Yes, China has a powerful military, but in recent decades it has focused on something else entirely. Control over the key choke points of the global economy, especially in the sectors of raw materials and critical minerals. And this gives China enormous leverage over the United States and other global powers, not through aircraft carriers and missiles, but through resources. And in many ways, this strategy can be even more effective than weapons. Once a single country gains control over the critical bottlenecks of the global economy, other nations begin to face serious problems that cannot be solved quickly. In this episode, we will take a closer look at what many analysts describe as China's hidden strategy, a plan that could, quite literally, choke the oxygen supply of the United States economy. This strategy is built on 5 fundamental pillars, and we will examine each of them. Let's begin with the first factor, one you have probably already seen in the headlines: China's growing control over the global market for strategic metals. At the beginning of 2026, China introduced restrictions on the export of silver, a metal that plays a critical role in the industrial and defense supply chains of the United States. Over the past year, silver prices have surged dramatically. China has effectively moved silver from the category of ordinary commodities into the category of strategic materials, placing it under export controls similar to those used for rare earth elements. Of course, China's dominance in silver production is not as absolute as it is in rare earth metals. But make no mistake, China still holds some of the largest silver reserves on the planet. More importantly, China controls roughly 60 to 70% of global supply chains related to this metal. Today, a large portion of the world's silver is being reserved for domestic use inside China. China is the world's largest consumer of silver. The country produces solar panels, electric vehicles, and consumer electronics on a massive scale. Chinese companies are even willing to pay suppliers above market price. In fact, buyers in China are offering as much as $8 above market price for physical silver, a premium of roughly 10%. As a result, a growing share of global silver production is being directed to China. The country is building enormous stockpiles while also producing a significant portion of the world's supply itself. And then something very important happens. China can begin restricting access to this crucial material for foreign buyers. The threat to global electronics supply chains has become so serious that even Elon Musk commented on it on the social platform X, saying, "This is not good. Silver is essential for many industrial processes." That is precisely why China has tightened control over silver, treating it not as a simple commodity, but as a strategic asset that must be protected. But silver is only part of the story. China is also moving to control something even more important: rare earth elements. This group of 17 elements from the periodic table forms the backbone of many modern technologies, especially military technologies. Despite their name, rare earth elements are not actually rare. Deposits exist across the globe, in Europe, the United States, Australia, Africa, and parts of Asia. So the scarcity problem is not about geology. The real bottleneck is processing. According to most estimates, China produces around 60 to 70% of the world's rare earth minerals. But far more important is what happens next. China controls roughly 85 to 90% of the world's processing and refining capacity. And this is the key strategic advantage. processing is where the real economic and geopolitical leverage exists. Why did this happen? The answer is relatively simple. Over the past few decades, many Western countries voluntarily abandoned these industries. Rare earth processing requires massive investments, creates serious environmental challenges, and is politically unpopular. China made a different decision. It invested heavily, accepted the environmental costs, and built a full industry ecosystem capable of processing rare earth materials at scale. As a result, even minerals mined outside China are often shipped there for processing before returning to global manufacturers. Processing means control over supply chains, contract conditions, and final pricing. When key links in the chain are concentrated in one place, dependency becomes not only technological, but financial. Rare earth elements are essential for modern life. They are used in electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, smartphones, data centers, advanced electronics, and military systems such as fighter jets, missile guidance systems, radar systems, night vision equipment, and precision weapons. In simple terms, these technologies don't just support economic growth, they underpin military power. This is why the United States has become deeply concerned about rare earth processing. Yes, new mines can be opened and new factories built, but that takes years. It requires infrastructure, regulatory approval, highly specialized experts, and enormous financial investment. What is most concerning is that China has already demonstrated its willingness to use this leverage. In 2010, during a diplomatic dispute with Japan, China sharply restricted rare earth exports, triggering price spikes and shockwaves across global supply chains. More recently, China again introduced export controls on critical materials as leverage during trade tensions with the United States. But strategic minerals are only the starting point. Control over the technologies built on those materials is even more important. And one of the most important technologies of the 21st century is semiconductors. You have probably heard about China's ambitions regarding Taiwan, but the reason may not be purely political. It's about control over global semiconductor production, and specifically one company, TSMC. Many people believe companies like NVIDIA, Apple, and AMD manufacture their own chips. In reality, these companies design chips, but the physical production of the world's most advanced semiconductors happens largely at TSMC. Technologies at the 3-nanometer scale and below are overwhelmingly concentrated there. In fact, roughly 80 to 90% of the world's most advanced chips are produced in Taiwan. This concentration represents one of the most serious vulnerabilities in the global economy. Modern semiconductors are no longer just components for consumer electronics. They are the foundation of artificial intelligence, data centers, cloud computing, advanced weapons systems, surveillance technologies, and virtually every piece of modern military equipment. From precision-guided missiles to autonomous drones to radar systems and secure communications. In simple terms, these technologies rely on manufacturing processes so complex that replicating them elsewhere would take many years. Advanced chips have effectively become the new currency of the technological world, and that currency is produced almost entirely on a small island just 160 kilometers from the Chinese mainland. This is why Xi Jinping regularly prepares China's military for a potential Taiwan scenario. China is building ships, conducting large-scale exercises, and increasing pressure around the island. Because if China were to gain control over this segment of the global economy, it would gain yet another powerful lever over the rest of the world, particularly the United States. Imagine a world where NVIDIA suddenly stops receiving AI chips. Imagine Apple being unable to manufacture iPhones or MacBooks. Imagine AMD halting shipments entirely. For the United States, that wouldn't simply be an inconvenience, it would be a systemic shock.
And that brings us to the fourth and fifth elements of China's strategy, the Belt and Road Initiative and what critics describe as debt leverage. The Belt and Road Initiative is essentially a global infrastructure development project. Through it, China is building a vast network of ports, railways, highways, pipelines, and energy infrastructure across multiple continents. This initiative connects China to trade routes around the world. On the surface, the idea appears straightforward and even beneficial. Economic cooperation, infrastructure development, economic growth. Many developing countries urgently need roads, ports, railways, and power plants, infrastructure they often cannot finance themselves. And to be fair, many of these projects do generate real economic benefits. But from a geopolitical perspective, the Belt and Road Initiative is about much more than
development. Since its launch in 2013, China has financed infrastructure projects in more than 140 countries. The total value of loans and investments exceeds $1 trillion. And these projects are not randomly distributed. They are concentrated around ports, railway corridors, pipelines, and energy routes, the arteries of global trade. This is crucial. Global trade flows through specific choke points, ports, canals, straits, and logistics hubs. Whoever can influence these choke points gains influence over the global economy. Through Belt and Road projects, Chinese state companies often become the builders, financiers, and sometimes operators of critical infrastructure along these routes. Even when the assets are not formally owned by China, the financing and operational roles create long-term dependence. This leads to the final component of the strategy: debt. Many countries participating in Belt and Road projects have limited access to Western capital markets. Loans from institutions like the IMF or the World Bank often come with strict conditions and lengthy approval processes. Chinese loans, by contrast, are faster and tied directly to specific infrastructure projects. But these loans can be extremely large. They are often denominated in foreign currencies and tied to projects that do not always generate sufficient revenue. A well-known example is the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. In the early 2000s, Sri Lanka wanted to develop its southern region and transform the country into a logistics hub in the Indian Ocean. But the government lacked the financial resources. China stepped in with loans and construction companies. On paper, it looked like a win-win arrangement. Sri Lanka would gain modern infrastructure. China would gain a commercial foothold along a critical trade route. But the project failed to generate enough revenue. By the mid-2010s, Sri Lanka was struggling to service the debt. In 2017, a deal was reached. China Merchants Port received control of the port under a 99-year lease. The arrangement effectively converted debt into equity. China, which initially entered the project as a partner and builder, ended up with long-term operational control over a strategic port on one of the world's busiest shipping routes. Sri Lanka, meanwhile, lost control of a critical piece of national infrastructure, not through invasion, not through military force, but through the terms of financial agreements. And this completes the 5 pillars of China's strategy. Silver and rare earth metals provide control over production. Semiconductors provide control over technology. The Belt and Road Initiative creates a global infrastructure network, and debt relationships deepen long-term dependence. Together, these 5 elements show that global power is not defined only by aircraft carriers and strategic bombers. Sometimes the decisive tools are contracts, infrastructure, and access to resources. China's strategy is patient and systematic. When a country controls the raw materials that power global industries, it does not need to threaten anyone with weapons. It can simply restrict access. When it controls processing, it decides who can manufacture advanced technologies. When it influences the infrastructure of global trade, it gains leverage over entire regions. And when debt dependence enters the picture, the political options of partner countries become increasingly limited. This is why many analysts view China's strategy as so powerful. It does not look like traditional aggression. It does not produce immediate shock. Most decisions appear technical, economic, even rational. But together, they create a new reality, a world in which China gradually becomes the central hub of the global economy, a system without which everything else begins to slow down. The United States understands this very well. That is why we now see massive subsidies for semiconductor factories, efforts to rebuild rare earth processing, tariffs, sanctions, and attempts to create alternative supply chains. But these changes cannot happen overnight. Modern economies are not armies that can be mobilized instantly. They are complex systems built over decades of globalization and integrated production networks. And in the event of a major crisis, whether it is a conflict around Taiwan, escalating trade wars, or a global recession, China could act asymmetrically. It could restrict exports, revise contract terms, or limit access to resources and infrastructure. And the consequences of such actions could be just as disruptive as a military confrontation. We are entering an era where global warfare may replace traditional military power, an era where the decisive factor is not the number of missiles, but control over the bottlenecks of the global economy. And China appears to have made its bet on exactly that. The real question is no longer whether a confrontation will occur. The question is when and in what form, because the next global conflict may not begin with gunfire, but with signatures on economic agreements.